a doctor's daughter who dreamed of one day becoming a paramedic. Described as a fantasist and a loner, this is the house where Tenniswood lived and where India died.
We would like to thank a number of people and organisations for their help and support during what has been an extraordinarily traumatic experience.
My heart goes out to her because me having children, you just never wouldn't have thought that. Literally, I'm in shock, that much shock. It's hard to talk.
We're all in shock, to be very frank and honest with you. With me seeing it now, it's just very shocking, and I don't understand how such a thing can happen around here.
India Eve Chipchase was born on December 24, 1995, in Northampton, England. She grew up in an affluent community with her parents, Suzanne and Jeremy, and her 3 siblings. India was known for her kindness, bubbly personality, and striking beauty. These traits made her naturally popular and well-loved by her friends. Beyond her charming demeanor, she was also a gifted saxophonist and an accomplished netball player. Yet, despite her talents in music and sports, India had always wanted to work in the medical field. This aspiration was largely inspired by her father, Jeremy, who was a well-respected obstetrician. In June 2014, India graduated from Northampton College with a diploma in health and social care. Shortly afterward, she began working as a healthcare assistant at St. Andrew's Hospital. While she found her role fulfilling, she quickly realized that her true desire was to become a paramedic. By late 2015, India left her position at the hospital with plans to eventually enroll in a paramedic's course. In the interim, she took on a part-time job as a bartender at Collingtree Pub in Northampton. On January 29, 2016, India wrapped up her shift at the pub around 8 p.m. Instead of heading home, she decided to stay a bit longer, with her boyfriend Grant Hare joining her for a few drinks. Though they had only been dating for 3 weeks, cracks were already beginning to show in their relationship, and that night was no different. As tensions rose, India chose to leave and invited her friends, Alice Lewis and Harry Moylan, to join her for a night out at another club. The trio ended up at NB's Cocktail Bar and Club, a popular spot within the bustling nightlife scene of Bridge Street, Northampton. They arrived at NB's at around 11:30 p.m. and headed straight to the bar. Eager to take her mind off of her relationship troubles, India ordered a round of Jaeger bombs for the group. After downing a few shots, they hit the dance floor to let loose and make the most of the night. At first, India seemed to be enjoying herself, dancing and laughing with her friends. However, after a few more drinks, her mood began to shift. She suddenly became irritable and started venting her frustrations about her boyfriend. Sensing her distress, Alice and Harry did their best to calm her down and offer support. Moments later, while Alice and Harry were momentarily distracted, an already heavily intoxicated India decided to wander off. When the two eventually noticed her absence, they became worried, prompting a frantic search through the club. However, after weaving through the crowd without success, Alice and Harry reluctantly stopped looking for her, assuming that India had either gone home or met up with other friends. In the early hours of January 30, 2016, India's mother, Suzanne, woke up to find her daughter's bedroom empty. While it wasn't uncommon for India to stay over at a friend's house, she always made sure to inform her parents whenever she did. The absence of a message this time immediately set off alarm bells for Suzanne. She began texting and calling India but received no response. By late morning, with still no word from her daughter, Suzanne's worry deepened. She took to Facebook and posted a status tagging India, asking her to message her that she was okay. Meanwhile, India's siblings reached out to her friends and co-workers. Among those they contacted were Alice and Harry, but neither they nor anyone else within India's social circle had any idea where she might be. With no one able to account for India's location, her siblings decided to track her phone using the Find My Phone app. To their surprise, it indicated she was on Stanley Road in Northampton. Although this was less than a mile from NB's nightclub, India's family didn't know anyone who lived there and wasn't aware of any friends she had in that area. By 4 p.m., India was supposed to start her shift at Collingtree Pub, hoping she might have turned up there. Her family called the pub, only to learn that India hadn't shown up. At that point, the family's concern turned into fear as they worried that something terrible might have happened to her. Immediately after speaking to India's employer, Suzanne contacted the Northamptonshire police to report her daughter missing. For most of the evening of January 30th, authorities worked to gather as much information as possible about India's last known movements. They interviewed Alice and Harry, who reported last seeing India around 12:45 a.m. inside NB's before she was separated from the group. Investigators also interviewed India's boyfriend, Grant, who revealed he was unaware that India had been trying to reach him in the early hours of January 30th. He explained that he was out of the house at the time when his phone died. When he returned home just before 3 a.m., he charged his device and discovered that India had called him 9 times and sent 2 messages asking where he was. The last call was logged at 1:28 a.m. Grant then recounted how he attempted to contact India multiple times shortly after 3 a.m., but she never answered. Given the late hour, he simply assumed she was already asleep and gave up trying. Since India was last seen at NB's, and her siblings tracked her phone to Stanley Road, investigators focused their attention on those 2 locations. At Stanley Road, no one reported seeing India at any point that day. At NB's, investigators requested CCTV footage from the night of January 29th into the early hours of January 30th. Unfortunately, they faced delays, as no staff member was available to provide a copy. And so, by the end of January 30th, 2016, the investigation remained at a standstill, with no new leads regarding India's whereabouts. On the morning of January 31st, 2016, Northamptonshire police decided to allocate additional resources to India's case. By this time, she had been missing for roughly 30 hours, and investigators began to suspect that the situation was more serious than they had initially thought. Some officers focused on analyzing India's phone data, while others returned to NB's to continue the investigation. Authorities then confirmed that India's phone had indeed been in the Stanley Road area, as her siblings had suggested. In addition, further analysis revealed that her phone disconnected from the network shortly after 2 a.m. on January 30th. Consequently, investigators resumed their canvassing of Stanley Road and nearby locations for any signs of India. Meanwhile, the officers who returned to NB's spoke with a door staff member, Dave Burry, who provided key information about India's movements that night. Dave recalled that around 1 a.m. on January 30th, India approached him, saying she desperately wanted to go home. Eager to help, he escorted her to a taxi, but when the driver noticed she was intoxicated, he insisted she pay in advance. This upset India, leading her to argue with the driver before leaving the cab. When India attempted to re-enter NB's, Dave denied her entry due to the club's strict policy against admitting heavily intoxicated guests. He then went back inside, but not before informing the other staff members to keep an eye on India. Frustrated, India slumped to the ground outside the club, seemingly uncertain about what to do next. Several other door staff later confirmed to investigators that they had seen India outside around that time. According to them, she appeared distressed, using her phone to text and make calls. However, none of them were sure what happened to her after that, since the area was also crowded with people trying to get into the club. Fortunately, investigators were eventually able to obtain NB's CCTV footage from the early hours of January 30th. They then promptly worked on determining just what happened to India after she was denied re-entry into the club. A 1:11 a.m. footage captured India trying to open the door of a locked car, likely mistaking it for a taxi. As this happened, a man standing in line outside NB's glanced in her direction. 2 minutes later, the same man approached India, who was back to sitting on the pavement, crying. The male that we saw approaching India was white, probably around 50 and quite stocky, not terribly tall, but with a balding head, and he was carrying a rucksack. He then helped her to her feet and spent the next 10 minutes speaking to her rather intently. He's very much in her face, touching her, and inches away from her face when just speaking to her, which just seemed quite unnatural. At 1:23 a.m., the man was seen escorting India away from NB's. By 1:25 a.m., the two got into a taxi. However, due to the grainy footage, investigators were unable to make out the taxi's license plate. Their challenges were further compounded by the lack of nearby surveillance footage that could reveal where the cab went. One thing was becoming increasingly clear, though. Whoever this man was, he likely played a key role in India's disappearance. To find India, they have to find this man. And the urgency of this is, well, it's incredibly urgent because they want to find India alive. And they know that as time ticks down, the chances of that become less and less. While investigators considered releasing the CCTV footage of the man to the public, they were concerned it might cause unnecessary distress to India's family. Thus, they opted to share the videos internally for the time being, hoping that one of the officers would be able to identify him. To the investigators' relief, it didn't take long for the breakthrough to come. Despite the poor quality of the videos, an officer came forward and identified the individual as Edward Tenniswood. The main reason the officer was able to recognize the 52-year-old man was because he had arrested him just days earlier for being drunk and disorderly. A background check then revealed that Tenniswood had also been arrested in mid-January 2016 for an unrelated offense. Even more concerning, detectives uncovered that he had previously been apprehended in the early 2000s for attempting to be intimate with a younger individual while he was already in his late 30s. The strange thing with Tenniswood, however, was that, notwithstanding the multiple arrests, he had never been convicted of any crime. Nevertheless, despite the limited available information about him, police officers quickly managed to locate his address. It turned out that Tenniswood resided at 6 Stanley Road, Northampton. This was the same area where India's phone was last tracked. So, there was a convergence of information gleaned by both the family and the police, and things were now starting to look very sinister. With a sense of urgency, Northamptonshire officers rushed to Tenniswood's home and arrived at about 3:45 p.m., still on January 31, 2016. They tried to knock on the front door multiple times. But since no one answered, they decided to force their way inside. What they immediately saw took them by surprise. Inside the premises were newspapers all over the floor. There were also rotting meals at the kitchen table. Most bizarrely, practically every item in the home was either covered in plastic wrap or draped with white sheets. It was immediately clear that Tenniswood's living conditions were far from ordinary. The officers then proceeded upstairs, where they made a gruesome discovery. In the front bedroom, they found India on a mattress on the floor, her body tightly wrapped in a sheet. Strikingly, her hair was tied atop her head in a way that resembled a halo. The only visible injury was a small cut behind her right ear, which had bled onto the sheet. However, it was evident that she had been dead for several hours. It was clear that India was dead. There was no need for us to call paramedics to the scene. Moments after discovering India's body, several officers left the scene to inform her family of the tragic news. The family was clearly devastated, having clung to the hope that she would be found alive. In an effort to console them, the responding officers assured the family that they would do everything possible to solve the case swiftly and bring justice for India's untimely death. With Edward Tenniswood now wanted for India's murder, authorities conducted door-to-door inquiries along Stanley Road, seeking to uncover more about who he was, what shaped his behavior, and most crucially, where he might be hiding. Tenniswood's neighbors then revealed that he was a former accountant who had been living at Stanley Road since 2010. Described as a recluse, he rarely left the house and never answered the door, no matter who knocked. Moreover, his curtains were always drawn, and only a single light in an upstairs room was ever seen glowing from inside. His landlord explained that the covers on Tenniswood's possessions were due to his obsessive-compulsive disorder and extreme aversion to dirt. On the rare occasions Tenniswood ventured out, it was usually to go drinking. Neighbors recalled seeing him return home intoxicated on several instances, leading them to suspect that he was an alcoholic. That afternoon, however, none of Tenniswood's neighbors knew his whereabouts. Since Tenniswood also didn't own a car, investigators turned to his phone data in hopes of finding a lead. The data indicated that Tenniswood was somewhere in Northampton town center, though his precise location remained unclear. Wanting to apprehend him as soon as possible, Northamptonshire police sent out over 80 officers within that area to find him. Knowing Tenniswood was a drinker, officers searched every local pub and wine bar, but he was nowhere to be found. Then, around 6 p.m., authorities received a crucial tip. Tenniswood had checked into the Ibis Hotel in Mayfair, Northampton, the previous night. Acting on the tip, officers headed straight to the hotel, arriving around 6:45 p.m. They quickly spotted Tenniswood sitting in the lounge, watching TV. Despite the sudden appearance of law enforcement, Tenniswood, who appeared sober, remained eerily calm. He even expressed mild surprise at their efficiency, stating, "You've clearly been to the house. You found something and I'm surprised you found me so quickly." A little over 40 hours after India Chipchase went missing, Edward Tenniswood was apprehended for her murder. But while Tenniswood's arrest went smoothly, his interrogation was a different story. Over the next several days, investigators attempted to question him about India's death. However, Tenniswood refused to cooperate, responding with a firm no comment to every single question. One of the most frustrating things that can happen as a police officer is having a suspect who responds with no comment, because throughout the interview, you still have to put the questions to them. You still have to give them the opportunity to answer. For example, if I ask a question and the person says no comment and states they're going to do a no comment interview, but then I don't put a relevant question to them, and later in court, they say, "I was never asked about it," that would go against the investigation and against that police officer. Nevertheless, despite Tenniswood's attempts to make things difficult for the investigators, they were eventually able to build a solid case against him. In the days following Tenniswood's arrest, several witnesses came forward, confirming he was the last person seen with India before her death. Among them was a couple who overheard Tenniswood talking to India outside NB's, reportedly persuading her to let him take her home. Another key witness was the taxi driver who drove the pair to Stanley Road. The driver noted that India remained silent throughout the ride, with Tenniswood doing all the talking. Additionally, a neighbor came forward, stating he saw Tenniswood leading a visibly intoxicated India into his home. Investigators also returned to Tenniswood's apartment after he was apprehended, uncovering several key pieces of evidence linking him to the crime. Among the findings were multiple photographs of women with long, dark hair similar to India's, suggesting that he had an unhealthy fixation with this type. India's cell phone was also recovered at the scene. More critically, though, officers discovered a pair of latex gloves with blood on the outside. DNA analysis later confirmed that the blood was India's, while the inside of the gloves contained Tenniswood's DNA. The autopsy later revealed that India had sustained over 30 injuries. Evidence also indicated that she had been violated before she died. Her cause of death was determined to be neck compression, confirming she had been strangled. The fact that India had Tenniswood's skin under her fingernails strongly indicated that she desperately fought for her life. Even though she had been intoxicated, she did not just submit to this, so this was something she was fighting for her life to avoid. On July 18, 2016, Edward Tenniswood's trial commenced at Birmingham Crown Court, drawing widespread media attention from across the United Kingdom. The courtroom was packed with reporters eager to cover the high-profile case. Throughout the proceedings, Tenniswood showed no remorse for his actions and appeared to revel in the media spotlight. At one point, he even voluntarily took the stand to proclaim his innocence. Tenniswood portrayed himself as being a victim, making comments along the lines of, "It's really distressing to have to dress a dead body." There was no remorse from Tenniswood at all. Tenniswood argued that India had willingly gone home with him. He claimed that after arriving at his apartment, they shared drinks, danced, and had fun together. He further alleged that they engaged in consensual intimacy that later became rough, leading to India's death. He remained adamant that it was not intentional, insisting her death was a tragic accident. In response, the prosecution emphasized Tenniswood's history of predatory behavior, including an incident in the early 2000s. They portrayed him as a calculated predator who, in the early hours of January 30, 2016, targeted a vulnerable young woman and exploited the situation in the most sinister manner possible. She was young, she was drunk, she was on her own. By definition, she was extremely vulnerable. And for that reason, she was easy to maneuver, manipulate, or steer into a situation where she would normally never have allowed herself to be in. What happened to her is down to the predator, that individual who targeted her because of her vulnerability, and it's absolutely not her fault. In addition, the prosecution underscored the overwhelming evidence that clearly demonstrated Tenniswood's guilt, leaving little room for doubt. He was a man on a mission, and my contention is that this was a premeditated act. This didn't happen randomly. That's what he set out to do. After 3 weeks of trial, the jury deliberated for just 2 hours before reaching a unanimous verdict. Edward Tenniswood was found guilty of all charges. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 42 years. For India's family, the conviction brought a measure of relief, though they knew that nothing could ever bring her back. It doesn't bring India back. Her family have got a sentence which is for life. They are never going to forget her. Her friends are never going to forget. The family, the whole community will never forget what happened on that night. In the aftermath of India Chipchase's tragic death, her family and community came together to honor her memory by taking proactive steps to protect others from similar dangers. One of the most impactful initiatives inspired by this tragedy is Northampton Guardians. Founded by India's mother, Suzanne, Northampton Guardians is dedicated to ensuring the safety of vulnerable individuals, especially those out at night for social events like parties and clubbing. Acting as guardian angels, the group provides a safe haven for anyone in need of assistance getting home. Since India's passing, they came on the scene to try and help people in town, like walking around town looking after vulnerable people. If you look at their logo, it's the love heart with the wings and it's got India's name in the middle. Through this initiative, India's memory lives on, transforming her tragic death into a catalyst for change and ensuring that she didn't pass away in vain. We love her now and will always love her. Even though we will never experience her smile, her laughter, her caring again, her photographs will adorn our walls, the memories of her 20 years will live on, and her spirit will always be in our hearts.